nice to see you. My name is Olesya Kramachuk. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Institute London. We are discussing a very important topic today, Ukrainian statehood and its connection to identity. Something that's been used and abused, I think, a lot in Russian propaganda, but also something that is being discovered by the world today, especially over the last 14 months. And we are absolutely delighted to welcome two speakers today who both specialize in issues of Ukrainian statehood and identity. I'll introduce both of them. Our guest speaker today is Professor Paul Robert Magocsi, who's board member of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter. He's a professor of history and political science at the University of Toronto and chair of Ukrainian studies. He's the author of over 40 books. I will not list them all, just a few, including Babyn Yar, History and Memory, Ukraina Redux, the one I'm holding here, and you'll be able to get your copy after the event in the library, on Statehood and National Identity, published last year, This Blessed Land, Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, published in 2022 as well, Jews and Ukrainians, A Millennium of Coexistence, published in 2018, Historical Atlas of Central Europe, published in 2018 as well. I can keep going. History of Ukraine, the Land and its Peoples, and Roots of Ukrainian Nationalism, which was published in 2002. And the event will be moderated by Dr. Marnie Howlett, who's the departmental lecturer in Russian and East European politics at the University of Oxford, where she teaches in both the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. Marnie holds a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She researches, her research centers on the intersection of cartography, nationalism, and geopolitics within the former Soviet Union, particularly focusing on Ukraine. And Marnie recently co-edited a volume researching in the former Soviet Union, Stories from the Field, for Bassin's Routledge series on Russian and East European studies. They should really rename that series, shouldn't they? Yeah. I hope they will. She's currently finishing a book, monograph Ukraine, an Imagined Borderland, which reconceptualizes the Ukrainian state with contemporary geopolitics. And I really hope that you will be talking about or problematizing this concept of borderland, which Marnie does in her research, as opposed to bordered land. I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Before I pass the invisible mic over to Marnie, and obviously our guest speaker, Professor Maґочій, I want to also introduce Natalia Fedosychak, Director of Communications of Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, to say a few words, because the UJE is partnering with us on this event, but also has partnered with us on many different projects, which have been very successful, and we're really excited about that partnership. Over to you, Natalia.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming. It's wonderful to be back in London, because we were here, well, I was here, I think the last time about 4 years ago, pre-COVID days, so the city has changed a lot, and it's wonderful to see people in person rather than over the screen. UJE was founded, Ukrainian Jewish Encounter was founded in 2008. We are a charitable organization founded in 2008 with the goal of having a dialogue between Ukrainians and Jews. We're very excited to be here today for this discussion. Professor Maґочій will speak about the book Babyn Yar, History and Memory, which is it's a publication that is seeing its first light in the English language speaking world. We in 2016 had a very large program dedicated to the 75th year anniversary of Babyn Yar in Kyiv. A English language and Ukrainian language edition of the book came out, but this book is substantially redone from that Ukrainian language publication, and I think it is a very strong testament that counters the propaganda that we see today coming out of the Russian Federation about Ukrainians and how they see their past and statehood. I invite everybody, when we are done, to take materials. We will have Ukraina Redu, which will also be discussed, other materials for you, and also Jews and Ukrainians, which is another very important publication that Professor Magocii was involved in. It is on this little flashcard, along with other materials and about UJE. So I'm looking forward to interesting, wonderful discussion tonight, and thank you for being here. So, Marnie.
No, I'm looking at that charming lady in the back there, standing by the door. You're not going to be tired standing up the entire time?
I can see you like this.
Ah, okay. See, I prompted and I got an answer. Actually, I am pleased to be here, but it's kind of strange. When I first walked in here, we have these kind of feelings of déjà vu. And this is actually true. I was in this building before, not in a dream, but sometime long ago in the early 80s, I think maybe 81, 82. Do you not have residences here where people sleep? Yeah. Well, so I stayed in this place, and the only difference was, I can assure you, we didn't have all of these attractive people of various genders. And it was a lousy, typical, cold, rainy London day. I was freezing, and the rooms were not necessarily overly heated at that time of the year. And so, yeah, I am back, and in much more comfortable circumstances. And so thank you very much for fixing up the place in the interim. Why are you people laughing?
Because there's an element of truth there. Best jokes are true ones.
That's what I'm saying. Why are you laughing? I'm not saying anything funny. I'm just making statements. What I was asked to do, at least initially, and I will do, is just say a few words about these three publications. The first one that was mentioned was this book called Jews and Ukrainians, which was issued first in English and Ukrainian back in 2016. And, you know, I feel very embarrassed, to be honest with you, that we don't even have the book. And instead of having the book, and it's especially very important, I just had a conversation with my colleague here about drawing maps. And in that book there are at least 20 maps, beautiful maps. Well, I need to show her the maps. And what do we get? This little card. Do you not have this book somewhere here? And if you don't have this book somewhere here, because I was just in the library, there's a comment on us, not on you. But in case you find it, please bring it around, because I have to show her something before she leaves, to go back north.
Book fair. It's at the
go to the London Book Fair? Well, okay, fine. All right, good. So the point is that book was actually an important book. Why was it an important book in the context of what we're speaking about today? Because it was the first, this was not either a history of Jews in Ukraine, nor was it only about Jews. It was about Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians, and Jews who live on the territory of that land, constituted in the boundaries that it has today. And it looks at all aspects of the civilizations of these two peoples. So it's not just history, geography, economics, folklore, language, literature, theater, music, etc. And actually go find a book in English about those aspects, all of them dealing with Ukraine. I mean, that's in and of itself. So, and the other thing is that the book was constructed in such a way that if some person of Jewish background wants to learn about their forebears or something about Jews in Ukraine, they can find out. They can read any of these subject areas. But to find out about Jews, they got to find out about Ukrainians at the same time, or vice versa. And that is very important, to not isolate one's interests and isolate the manner in which knowledge is presented. because you must learn in context and not selectively. I don't know if any of you are of Jewish background, but Salo Baron, the kind of dean of Jewish scholarship, wrote a 12-volume history of Jews in the world from ancient times to the present, and it was he who said, most Jewish historiography is written from a perspective as if the Jews dropped from the sky because it's totally in isolation from the environment around them. And that causes a whole host of self-perceptual problems and how one presents oneself to the outside world. And that book is a very important instrument of undermining isolation. The second book that was mentioned is called Babyn Yar, History and Memory. Babyn Yar has become, unfortunately, the symbolic place for one of the two Holocausts. There is the Holocaust of ovens and the Holocaust of bullets. We all know, and I've heard, that the first one is symbolized by Auschwitz. The second one is symbolized by Babyn Yar, where during those 2 days in late September 1941, just under 34,000 Jews were shot. This book is the first book that looks at Babyn Yar in a complex setting. It's not just about what took place during those 2 days or the rest of the war. And as we also know, even during that short period of time, it wasn't only it was not only the Jews of Kiev who were shot on those 2 days, but then many more were liquidated for the rest of the next 2 years of the war, as well as Soviet prisoners of war, among whom there were numerous Ukrainians, Ukrainian nationalists, other peoples, etc. So it became, alas, a general killing place for a whole host of all of the peoples and all of the cultures that lived on that territory. And the other aspect of this is the history and memory. It's kind of divided into 3 parts. The first part is the background leading up to World War II, and not only politically. Actually, the first chapter has to do with the topography of the place and what role Babyn Yar played in the evolution of the city of Kiev from at least the mid-19th century. And it was historically a place of cemeteries for everybody, including not only Jews and Orthodox Christians. There's a Protestant cemetery there, Karaite cemetery there, Muslim cemetery there. It's quite fascinating. So all of that is described in the first part, moving up to the tragic events of World War II. But then even as important is the third part of the book, which for all intents and purposes is what we can call Babyn Yar après Babyn Yar. That is Babyn Yar after Babyn Yar. How is Babyn Yar this symbol? How has it been remembered? How has it been interpreted? So, for instance, there are separate chapters on oral history, those who recalled and were eyewitnesses to what took place. There's a chapter on literature, how literary figures, novelists, etc. Just this book someone showed me today, I think, Natalia showed me that this book by Kuznetsov has been republished. So when you go into bookstores, you see this book in yellow, says Babyn Yar. Well, really what that is a novel that Kuznetsov wrote. That novel and many others, including Yevtushenko and all the other important writers. There's a whole chapter on literature, is how Babyn Yar had been depicted subsequently in literature. There's a chapter on the cinema, very important, of how Babyn Yar has been depicted in the cinema. And then lastly, how it has been commemorated or mistakenly commemorated or unfortunately commemorated, but nonetheless, that even has a history. So that is the kind of importance of that book, Babyn Yar, History and Memory. The third book is not really a book. It's a mini essay. This thing called Ukraine Redux. There it is. Okay, so if anyone's going to ask someone, asking, Marnie might ask. I'm just joking. I just met Marnie, what, about an hour ago? Great person. We love her. And so I have to rechristen her name in the Cambridge, Massachusetts variety at Harvard, because in Boston her name becomes Marnie. So if I miss and say Marnie, you'll know who I'm talking about. Now how do we get off onto that one? Okay, in any case, we promise to not laugh too much because some of this stuff we're speaking about is serious. So this Ukraine Redux, and the reason I know how, because what's the word redux, right? And how you even pronounce it. So if that comes up, we'll talk about that. I say it's not a book because it actually is a report. In 2018, the government of Ukraine took out a suit against the Russian Federation at the International Court of Justice in The Hague for the occupation of Crimea. And the accusation was violation of human rights of ethnic Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And for the International Court, high-end legal counsel, law firm in Washington, D.C. and London. The law court has, you know, as any legal firms, they call before the court and the submissions legal experts or experts. So I actually serve as the expert to the court for the government of Ukraine on this matter. And part of that was writing first an expert report, which the first one was devoted exclusively to the question, focusing specifically on Crimea, because that's the case, and to the question of violation of human rights of Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians. Of course, the defendant has an opportunity to defend him or herself. In this case, it's a state called the Russian Federation. And so they had a year and a half to respond to the Ukrainian submission, or submission from Ukraine. And when they came back, they also hired their experts. And as a colleague of mine said, you know, you're crazy to do this because they will just, you know, pull out all their experts, an entire academy. And that's what they did. It was the Academy, Russian Academy of Ethnography, who wrote a 100 single-space rejoinder to my report with 5 authors from their experts of various kinds. Okay, another year goes by. There is a retort from Ukraine and then a counter-retort from Russia, to which then I'm asked to write a second report, because the criticism of the first, my expert report, was basically the line that, well, you know, Ukraine is not really a state. It's just something that came into being recently. It was created by the Soviet Union. And as for ethnic Ukrainians, what is an ethnic Ukrainian? What is a Ukrainian? I mean, most of these people, certainly in Crimea, let alone in the eastern part of the country, they all speak Russian. They don't, you know, Ukraine is just a nominal thing. It's the standard Ruski Mir line. And so the response to that is this. It's kind of redone in a way, not exactly, because there's certain formulas that have to be done for the court starts off with who you are and how wonderful you are, and each expert has to say what they do. So, well, we took all of that stuff out. But nonetheless, the substance of the text is the same, and we added these great maps, 6 maps, to show that the idea of Ukrainian statehood is slightly older than 1991. Just a bit, just a tad. So that's the context of these 3 books. And now Marnie is going to say something.
Like he mentioned, we have been laughing for the last hour or so. So it's been really a lovely day already to get to know someone who I really looked up to and have read much of his work, including several books. I even brought one with me from Oxford that I was explaining to Professor Maґочій that sits on my desk to teach my students at Oxford a brief history of Ukraine. As I learned this evening, it's a very old version and perhaps might be redone. However, it's a very great, if you don't have it, I mean, I will promote it. It's a really great way to learn about Ukraine. And I think, especially in the contemporary day, many of us are visual learners, and the maps are a great tool. And this is what I find with my own students. Maps are something that both of us share as something we're very passionate about. Obviously, much of his work centers around maps and drawing maps. And same with myself as a political scientist. I'm not a historian. However, I see significant value in using maps in my own work. If anyone's read my work, Leslie mentioned it briefly, but what I seek to do, and I'm not here to talk about it extensively, but what I do is to take much of what Professor Maґочій just spoke about, but now to contemporize it, I suppose, or to ask people how they see themselves within space. And so Professor Maґочій just mentioned, and as much of his work shows, we see the historical context of Ukraine. We see how it has changed so many times. I mean, this atlas shows this over and over again through so many maps. I mean, he's produced hundreds, if not thousands, of maps in his life to show how the borders of Ukraine has changed and continues to change. I mean, even up to the contemporary day, we're seeing, whether this be internally, domestically, or from foreign administrations or invaders or other powers trying to change the borders of Ukraine. But with that, and a theme that I think runs through both of our work, especially my own, is trying to elevate the agency of the people who experience these changes. And so what I do is I basically take what he does, but I ask the people to draw themselves in space. And I give them the maps, and I ask them to draw how they see themselves and where they believe their lines should be. And then we can connect that to politics much more broadly in the contemporary day. And I'm not going to go too much into that, but I think that's something really important. And I think it's great reminder, we don't talk about this enough when we talk about Ukraine, especially right now. We talk about how, the West sees Ukraine. We talk about how Russia obviously sees Ukraine, or Putin, or the regime, or whoever we want to speak about. We don't often enough talk about how Ukrainians see Ukraine and where they want their borders to be, how they've historically been drawn, but more specifically how these legacies, and the legacies we're talking about, whether this be about Baban Yar, whether this be about the Jews, whether this be any ethnic group that lives in Ukraine, how do they see the territory, the land, those places that hold significance to them? In my work, I asked the people this, to talk about the different places that hold significance to them. So as the borders have changed, the land has remained the same. Land is always there, places are always there, and these places hold meaning, these places inform identities. We know this as political scientists, but these places continue to hold significance. I think everyone in this room can think of places, whether this be the country they're from, the city they're from, maybe not Saskatoon in my case, being somewhere that may be the best.
Where?
But we all hold places at any different spatial scale. This could be our country, your city, or even simply a smaller field or meadow that holds significance to you. These places shape our identities, and when we think about Ukraine and when we think about politics, this is something we need to think about, is how do people see themselves, and how does that help us better understand politics playing out before our eyes? How does this help us understand why Ukrainians are defending their land? Well, of course, because they feel attached to something, like we all do, regardless of what spatial scale that's at. And of course, if we feel attached to something, not only will we identify with it, but we're going to defend it when it is under attack. At the same time, it helps us also understand, perhaps, a bit of how it explains Russia's aggression. If, hypothetically, they do see Ukraine as being part of their territory, they will try to seek it. And of course, this is the propagated narrative here, but at least it helps us understand how they see it or what their motivations are if in this spatial imaginary that they hold or the attachments they see, Ukraine is significant. Again, going back to many of these borders that we've drawn here. With this, and I think you really mentioned, is the significance of land, of place, of identity, and how they're connected, but also these legacies and how these legacies track across history. So not only from 1991, but across time, and how do people remember these narratives? How do these narratives inform how people identify, whether this be ethnically, religiously, ideologically? But now, as we see a new state or perhaps nation being built, how will this going forward shape the ways that people see their state and their nation? And I think these are really important questions to be asked. These are the ones I ask in my own work. I'm sure many of you can talk about this, and we will talk about this evening. These are sort of my opening remarks and questions and ponderings I wanted to speak about. But what I know I'm meant to do as a moderator, and I think we want this to be as a conversation between us, but also really much a conversation between everyone in this room. You've taken the time to be here post-pandemic. In-person events might be a bit harder than perhaps pre-pandemic, so the fact that you've taken the time to be here is really important to all of us. And so I really hope we can spend quite a bit of time taking questions from the audience and engaging with each other. One question, though, I thought I would pose to Professor Magocsi, but perhaps as a starting basis for our larger discussion, is to talk about these legacies and how we've seen Ukraine change through time, through your own work. What do you see as the most important legacies in the contemporary day? Or are there any specific historical examples or these legacies that we can see really playing out today?
I used to like to say before 1991, which was a very successful event following on the most important event in the 20th century, which was not 1914 or 1945, but 1989, the collapse of communist rule throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union. These were monumental events. And I used to point out to people of Ukrainian background and non-Ukrainian background that Ukraine is this phenomenal success story. And why? Because if we're talking 1989, 1990, about 150 years before that, there were no Ukrainians. Now, when I say that, I can just see those people of Ukrainian background. What? What are you talking about? How can you dare say such a thing? Of course there were Ukrainians. There were Ukrainians forever. Well, in 1850, there were no Ukrainians. Literally. There was a population living in two empires. Hardly any of them in either of those empires, if asked, call themselves Ukrainians. They may have been Little Russians, Malorossi, Ruthenians, Rusini, whatever. Not only did this population, which we now call ethnic Ukrainian, did not exist in roughly 1850, that 100+ years ago, but it had nothing to do, aside from the fact that they didn't use an ethnic term, Ukrainian, they didn't have the sense that they belonged to a larger people, and a larger people that not only is in other parts of one of the states in which they live, but in the other state. Well, 150 years later, they have an independent country. And at least for a while, it was what, the third or fourth largest nuclear power, because they had all these nuclear arms left over from a previous regime. Well, you stop and think about it, that's pretty remarkable. Now, we also know that that transformation of the land of Ukraine in 1991 into an independent state came at relatively no cost. And the population who lived on that land was still carrying over cultural baggage, or as you say, legacy from the past. And what was some of that legacy of the past? This is that not all ethnic Ukrainians in 1991, if they didn't feel that way in 1850, well, because of the complicated evolution of Ukrainian lands being ruled by various regimes, many of these in the, the Mzukaz banning the Ukrainian language in the late 19th century, or the policy of the Soviet government from the 1930s on. There was all of these efforts to limit, change the sense of Ukrainianness. And so that legacy, that cultural baggage was carried on. So many people in 1991, they're okay, we're living in a place called Ukraine, but it was called Soviet Ukraine before, so what? We still speak Russian perhaps, and we may speak Ukrainian, but if we go to the big cities and if we go to the university, we better speak Russian because that's the only serious language, right? So many people still had that attitude. Part of that cultural baggage just fell down. I can see it. Right. So much for that culture. You were basically saying, yeah, that cultural baggage existed, but we don't want that anymore. We got rid of it. And actually, is my point, part of my point, what I'm talking about, for many of you people, you don't even know what I'm talking about because you don't have that cultural baggage. You are of a different generation, thank God. You were born after the Soviet Union for the most part. And even those of you who still may have been born in the Soviet Union, you were too young. You now have a whole generation of Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians. And so this is part of this evolution. And of course, even after having an independent state, as I said, you still had these, the baggage. The baggage started to get cleaned up for the first time, in which was, in many ways, the first serious revolution, and that was the Orange Revolution. To my mind, that was more serious than the Maidan. Why? Ukrainians never, as a stateless people, were aware of their own existence and that they had power and that they could make decisions and they could change things. Embedded in their cultural psyches was that they were an object to be manipulated and not able to determine their own fate. What was remarkable about the Orange Revolution is they went out to the streets and they did change their political fate. No one thought that they could do it. They didn't think themselves that they could do it. But they did. And that was the beginning of a change in the mentality. That was the true revolution. Because without that change, you cannot then act. Later, in many ways, the Maidan was simple. You already knew that you could change things, so you're threatened with some other unpleasant political situation. What do? You go out to the streets and you change it again. And then you even get rid of your president. Now you still had some cultural baggage hung over from that older generation, not you younger people. You younger people were okay. But those older ones, as I always say, by the way, you want to change a society? You know what you have to do to change a society if you have a revolution? This was the great mistake of the Bolsheviks. They didn't kill all the grandmothers.
Oh yeah, that's what Patriarch Tikhon said.
Fine, okay, well, but the point, so he's maybe smart, but the Bolsheviks weren't smart. I'm very serious here. If you study national movements and national revivals, the function of grandparents in preserving and passing on to the next generation, much more important than schools, much more important than one's own parents. And so what did the Bolsheviks do? They declared equality. Everyone's equal. And we're going to create a new person. We're going to transform history. But since everyone is equal, they make the parents, the husband and the wife, go out and work. Well, who's going to take care of the kids? The social network, they tried, but it wasn't sufficient enough. So who took care of the kids? The grandparents. And so now you have the young kids getting all of these tales and all of these stories about how things were, who we are. I mean, this is like crazy. If I were Stalin or Lenin, I would have got rid of them all, if you want to have a successful revolution. So I'm not being facetious here. So similarly, in this sense, the cultural baggage, even after independence, even after the Orange Revolution, even after the Maidan, and this varied from region to region in Ukraine, from age groups, cohorts to age group cohorts in Ukraine, but there were still a lot of people who were not yet fully committed to the idea that being an ethnic Ukrainian not only means having a culture and having a language, but that you know what you are, you're proud of your state. And it didn't make a difference also whether you were an ethnic Ukrainian or not. You could have been one of the other many peoples living on the territory of Ukraine. That happened only thanks to whom? Ukraine's little brother to the north. Actually little in size and historically little. Because Ukraine, that was the first Rus, that outer Rus up in the north was the secondary one. It's thanks to threats from the outside and actual annexation of territory, and then now the final act for him, the brutal invasion of the country that has now cemented Ukrainians into a nation willing to do whatever it takes to protect themselves and their country. And hence, that's what I see in terms of an evolution of the legacy of the past being transformed, which is miraculous because 150 years ago and now less than 200 years ago, now Ukrainians and now, say that to anybody in the world. In the world, because everyone knows who Ukrainians are. That's another thing. So that's how I would answer that question.
Well, you answered almost all of my questions through your
Pardon?
I'm kidding. We could speak all night. But with this, I mean, very fascinating points you picked up on. One in particular, I think, first of all, about the grandmothers is interesting because that's also a narrative I've heard several times in my own field work from people I've interviewed, is exactly that, is the fact that the generations, the legacies being able to be passed down through 3 generations versus 2 dozen has, I mean, not only come from the historian, but from people on the ground really verify that. But with this, perhaps it is important for us to unpack a little bit the civic understanding of nationalism and identity, and also this ethnic understanding. So you mentioned, and it's true, in Ukraine, it's not just Ukrainians and Russians, and we continue to talk about this. The Western narrative continues to be Russian versus Ukrainian, whether linguistically, ethnically, socially. How can we understand more the reality on the ground, and perhaps, I mean, you can speak more a little bit to where does this come from? Although there hasn't been, for anyone who knows, there hasn't been a census in Ukraine since 2001. We don't actually know the numbers, but we can, I mean, estimates I've heard upwards of 100 different national groups or ethnic groups within the country, even though we continue to focus on, these 2 dominant ones. But yet these other ethnic groups that exist in the country are very important, and especially going forward will be very key when we think about what peace in any capacity looks like and how we recognize these national minorities in whatever form. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but how do we really separate or understand, Ukraine as a state, but also Ukrainians as an ethnic group? Do they coincide? Do they have to? Do we see something else coming forward? Perhaps a stronger sense of civic identity that wasn't there?
First of all, I would begin by saying that Ukraine is a normal country. I know Ukrainians would like to feel that they're exceptional. Sorry. You're normal, like most countries in the world, and also most countries in the context of where Ukraine physically is, that is Europe. And the first sense of normality is the fact that not only have you had checkered histories, or all of these countries of Europe have checkered histories with borders changing and peoples being ruled by the nation. So, like, what's new? Ukraine has been ruled by many countries. Oh, really? And Italy, that didn't even exist until 1859? Or Germany? I mean, you know, like, what's new? It's kind of like a silly statement. But aside from that, Ukraine is normal in the sense that, like every European country, has more than one people living within its boundaries. And here I'm not talking about immigrants. That's a different story. I'm talking about people who have been living sur place in the same place for generations upon generations for thousands of years. I mean, look, we're sitting here in a country that is, you know, only one portion of a England. I mean, what about, you know, the Welsh are the Welsh and the Scots are the Scots. Don't forget the Cornish down there in the far left. They still exist, and they would like to exist as distinct people, let alone the monks, and we can go on and on and on. Right? You guys got national minorities too. You just don't want to recognize it because the British, like the French, are imperialists. So worse than the Russians. It's another story. I have my Scottish friend back here, and we had an argument. He invites me to his house the other night. We knew each other only through correspondence. He invites me to his house, and it took us like about 3 or 4 minutes, and he says, "Yes, I'm Scots, but I'm a unionist. All my life I fought for this." Well, I'm not. I'm pro. If Ukraine is not Russia, Scotland is not England. So that's how we got off on this. And we still smile at each other, and that's okay. Point is, Ukraine is a country of numerous nationalities. This 100 number is a silly number because it includes, you know, 10 Azeris or Koreans or Vietnamese, so it's not 100, but there's a lot of them, right? There's a good 50 ethnicities living on the territory of Ukraine that have their own evolution, their own development, and have been there going back to pre-Kievan times. Certainly if we talk about Crimea and the southern shores or the northern shores of the Black Sea. So in the sense that Ukraine, being a normal country with various peoples living within it, the next thing is how to define a Ukrainian. Well, actually, the Constitution that was adopted in 1996, in one of its first 2 or 3 statements, does define what a Ukrainian is. It does. It says that a Ukrainian is every resident, every citizen of the country, regardless of their national, ethnic, religious background. And so what does that mean? What that means is that, as I say, and even in this thing, in arguing, we have Polish Ukrainians, we have Jewish Ukrainians, we have Crimean Tatar Ukrainians, we have Magyar or Hungarian Ukrainians, we have Russian Ukrainians, Greek Ukrainians, Romanian, Moldavan, and we can go on and on and on. Everyone who lives on the territory of Ukraine and is a citizen of Ukraine, and by the way, we also have ethnic Ukrainians. You notice I continue to use the word ethnic Ukrainian. It's a point here, very important. Because there's a difference between being a Ukrainian and being an ethnic Ukrainian. Right? In a sense, let's see, okay, one would have to be smarter than I am to figure out some kind of a cute term to do this, so I'm not even going to try it because I'll probably mix it up. The point is that every person in Ukraine, regardless of their ethnic background, is Ukrainian, period. They're born on this territory. The state now defines what that territory is. They are citizens of the country. End of discussion. Now, however, having just stated that, and even in the Constitution, does not necessarily make it reality in the minds of the people. Because in the minds of the people, as part of cultural baggage, new states still think in general in ethnic terms. Because what I've just said about Ukraine and its various nationalities could be said about Slovakia. Well, when Slovakia came into being in 1993, it's slightly younger than Ukraine. Not every Magyar, ethnic Magyar, would say that he's Slovak. He or she is Slovak. Because they're still thinking in ethnic terms. It takes time for the idea of belonging to a state to develop a state, or what is sometimes called civic identity. That is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It can happen a little quicker amongst younger generations because you go to school, and if the school program teaches you that all you people are Ukrainian, who cares whether your mother was Moldavan or your father was a Jew, or who cares? You're all Ukrainian. You can be that too. Right? But for the older generation, they still think in ethnic terms. And therefore, if they still think in ethnic terms, well, you can't be a Ukrainian unless you speak Ukrainian, and unless you identify as Ukrainian. Right? I mean, this is the kind of standard old part of the cultural baggage of the past. To get away from that and think of being Ukrainian in the broader sense, in the civic sense, is a process. And that process, again, as I spoke before, goes through stages. And just like feeling your loyalty to the state, the idea of identifying that state as a civic identity has also gotten more and more widespread through these revolutions and finally to the present. Now, still there has to be done work. The educational system necessarily doesn't teach this strongly enough. It has to be revised. Not everyone in Ukraine speaks like I am too, as if, you know, it's, right? Can you imagine?
I don't want to.
But it's a...
I'm kidding.
What is it with the... I made a statement and they're laughing. But that's a process, and we'll get there.
Wow. Too good? Okay.
Your turn. You can go now.
I wasn't sure where you were going with that. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, and if we had, I mean, several days, I'm sure we'd continue this discussion, but I think it's really important that we bring in some people from the audience. Unfortunately, I don't like this chair is scheduled. I feel like you're a bit behind me. With that, perhaps it's worthwhile to take some questions from the audience. With this, I'm going to encourage you, or I, to speak briefly so we can encourage as many questions as possible. Perhaps we'll take one from both sides, and then...
And the questions can be addressed to either of us, and either of us can answer the questions, correct?
Correct.
Good.
Does anyone from this side? Sorry, you're kind of separated. Alessia?
But I don't want to monopolize this.
Anyways, okay, we've got one on this side. Yes?
I can ask the Professor, are you a Ukrainian according to your definition, or are you a Canadian? What does it matter?
Well, my actual identity, and the most important identity, is I am from New Jersey and very proud of it. While I lived in the United States where I was born, I was secondarily an American. And now I live in Canada, but I really don't live in Canada. I just work in Canada. My body is there, but not my soul. I do have a Canadian passport, but only got it by default, not because I wanted it. So now I have two of them. And when asked about my ethnic heritage, because we all come from somewhere, and certainly the United States and Canada, for that matter, are immigrant countries. So my ethnic heritage is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily Carpatho-Rusin. And the other small portion is Hungarian. and hence the name Magocsi on my father's side, is spelt in the Hungarian manner. Now, however, my mother was actually born on the territory of Ukraine. So had Ukraine passed a law allowing the diaspora people to get passports, I had full right to get a passport. And I probably would have done it just for the hell of it. You know, why have two, why not have three? But they never allowed that. So that is the answer to, the simple answer to your question.
So you're a person of many identities, many cultural backgrounds.
Every one of us in the world and every one of us sitting in the room are people of various identities. We all have multiple identities. Some of you sitting in the room, if you are, well, you can be English and British. You can be, but some of you, if one would ask, you'd identify first with your football team, whether you're Manchester City or whatever. Or, as in the United States, you would identify first with your university. I'm from Princeton as opposed to being from Harvard. And I can tell you there's a big difference. So we all have different identities, which is natural. We choose which ones is necessary in the conversation. So yeah, I'm a person of multiple identities.
Well, thank you both, firstly, for a fascinating and very enjoyable conversation. I think all of us are really privileged to be...
And it's not over.
It's not over. It's just beginning. You spoiled it a little bit by mentioning Manchester City, but apart from that...
I have a son-in-law who's from up there, and see, I'm au courant. Not much, but a little bit.
A very different identity.
Yes, thank you.
As well. But what I'd like to ask both of you, as deep thinkers about the nature of identity, Ukraine, a lot of historians would say, had two identities, separate identities evolving over the years. I mean, I'm just beginning to research this, and my supervisor, Professor Wilson, he always talks about Ukraines. Andrew, he talks about two Ukraines in his books, about the Dnieper Ukrainians and about the Western culture in Ukraine, and he looks at them as evolving quite separately. And we can superimpose on top of that the various philosophers who've looked at the difference between the steppe and the forest, the city and the village, which kind of coincide with those two identities. If we look at how those have evolved, would you say that a third identity of Ukraine is now emerging, which is actually quite different to those two, which is connected more with technology, innovation, and an outward way of thinking about Ukraine's place in the world, rather than the more inward-looking two different identities which evolved before that? I'd really like to ask both of you about that.
You first, because I'm ready.
Yeah, I mean, I have much to say on the topic itself, especially this is a question I was going to pose earlier, was this idea of, or this old idea of Ukraine, two Ukraines, or it being divided along the Dnipro, having an East versus West identity. I would say, as a political scientist, this has been debunked several times throughout history, especially since the Maidan, is that these identities, historically they're there, they have been there. However, in the contemporary day, we see this shifting. We see more ethnic Russians speaking Ukrainian, identifying with the Ukrainian state. And this really goes back to this idea of what is an ethnic identity and what is a civic identity, and where we see these holding importance at different times and in different places. I really, in my own work, try to push back against this sort of simplifying Ukraine to just East versus West and not looking from the bottom up to realize that there's much more going on. Although I think, and I'm sure he'll have much to say, is that we can't deny the fact that different halves of the country were under different empires for a very long time, and these do continue to influence different politics in different ways. There's recent studies, from 2018 approximately, where you can still see where some of the borders were historically drawn. On either side, people still vote in slightly different ways. Even if they're speaking the same language, there are these historical memories, legacies, psychologies perhaps, of how people saw themselves, because you had generations of people living in very different empires or very different regimes. So whether or not it influences their identity and to such an extent that it influences politics could be a question, especially once the war is over. But it is there in some way, whether this be at a very innate or kind of a granular level, there is something there that can't be overlooked. However, I don't think it's as simplistic as has been written about, especially since 1991 until the Orange Revolution, is just simplifying Ukraine to kind of East versus West or left versus right. I think it's a much too simplistic way to understand identity in the country.
See, I don't know her. I never met her. She hasn't been my student. But what else am I going to say? She's got it all right, because that's what I would say. But it's true. Andrew Wilson, very nice guy. Every time we sit down together, I like him very much. You can tell him you met Magocsi. Say hello to him for me. But he's got it wrong. He's got it wrong. Why does he have it wrong? This is because Slavic scholarship, in particular in Great Britain, has been, let's say, old-fashioned, beginning with terminology. It took British scholars forever to get away from Kievan Russia to Kievan Rus. And we can go on and on and on. They were not on the cutting edge in Slavic scholarship across the board, not only in terms of Ukrainian studies. But having now been not nice to my hosts in this country, nonetheless, that just to stop and think about the concept of East versus West, or West versus East. Well, the West maybe is easy to define, maybe, because Western Ukraine, one assumes, right, is Galicia, Bukovina, and Transcarpathia, those lands that have been were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But really what they're talking about is not those three, because the historical evolution of Transcarpathia is so different from all Ukrainian lands that some people think it's not even part of Ukraine, including Ukrainians when they visit there. And yet it's thrown into this term of the West. The really West, and what about Western Volhynia? The real West, when we're using this dichotomy, is Galicia, right? So that's already one issue. East? What is the East? Is Kiev part of the East? Which means it's Kiev and people in the Kiev area think and act and have had historical traditions similar to those in the Donbass, let alone in southern Ukraine, in the steppe area? This dichotomy, very useful for certainly political scientists or historians who have more political science bent. And then when there's a political crisis and their subject comes onto the news, they have to think of an easy way to explain it. You have to figure out what your sound bite is going to be when you get that 30 seconds. And so the East-West dichotomy makes it look interesting and makes it look easy. Why? Because it also plays into a whole host of other stereotypes. The West were the super-nationalists. They were the extremists. They were the ones during World War II who killed people who weren't ethnic Ukrainian, whether they were Poles or they're Jews. So it's easy to label all of them. Whereas those in the East had spent more time under the glorious Soviet Union to cleanse them of all of these negative features. So you see how this makes it easier to do a dichotomy which never existed to begin with. So that's how I would just simply reiterate what my colleague has just said.
But what I was trying to get at,
okay.
I love the background, but
okay.
what I was trying to get at was the new identity.
Yeah.
Yes, okay,
yeah,
fine. Yes, absolutely.
If we look at the industrialized East and the more rural parts of the West with their folk culture. A lot of people thought that the Ukraine that would emerge would be some kind of synthesis or accommodation between the two. But if you look at all the people who are the spokespeople for Ukraine, coming from the media, technology, innovation industries, who identify with President Zelensky, they don't really, the younger people, I could be wrong, but the people I speak to don't really identify too much with either of those two Ukraines. It's a new, outward-looking Ukraine. Look at all the startups in Ukraine. Not, you know, Russia has this imposed identity from Putin. We're the Orthodox believers. We're the antidote to the gay, Black Lives Matter movement that's hijacked the West. Ukraine isn't imposing this. You've got a new identity that appears to be emerging organically itself.
Sir, you've posed the question and you've answered it. You're right. Absolutely. You're just saying it in a different way that we have said it before. You use the term outreach and modernization with technology and so forth and so on. We use political terms. But yes, there are a new generation of Ukrainians. And this new generation of Ukrainians have come about because of the political circumstances, some of which I've mentioned. It's part of this process. And this is where it's gotten itself to. And that's it. So you're right, absolutely.
And I mean, I would flip it, right? To say that there's a third suggests that there's two, which we just said there's not two. So therefore, it's not a third. Right. This is what modern society is. In Ukraine, but also elsewhere around the world too, right? It's realizing that we've continued to, the West is equally as guilty, and I mean, I write about this in my own book, is the West and the East are equally guilty in superimposing or putting their own ideas of what Ukraine should be on Ukraine, rather than allowing Ukrainians to speak and tell who they are. And now we see it in the media in the last year because it's been circulated. I mean, Zelensky's really helped with this. However, that wasn't new. People just didn't look. And those of us who understood the country before have been saying this, and of course, you know, Ukraine was not on the radar until the 25th of February in the way that it should have been. However, this is not new. It's just the fact that we've continued to see it, or the West has continued to use this narrative. It is divided along the East and the West, and so suddenly we're surprised when, oh, they're not. There's something else. But that's because we wanted it to be the simplified version. We're not looking from the bottom up. And I think if anything, if there's any takeaway from today, listen to the grassroots rather than just putting our own ideas, and be critical of ourselves. And I think that's really important. We can be very critical of Russia, and we will continue to be, but we also need to be very critical of the West, and it's our own position and how we've seen Ukraine up until the 24th of February. We've got some finger hands. Okay, Les, are you a two-finger?
What?
Are you, you good?
Yeah. No.
I don't know.
To wait.
Let's go right in the back. Yeah, because you're way in the back.
Just some points and then the question. First of all, somehow, as a person who believes I'm fourth at least ethnic Ukrainian, whenever Ukrainian identity is being discussed in a non-Ukrainian environment, for some reason I feel as if I'm endangered as species, to be honest. Somehow it feels more secure when especially Western scholars, for example, are discussing, I don't know, about English identity, French identity, and it feels for some reason very dangerous when we are discussing Ukrainian identity, because somehow I think because of the Russian propaganda which has put Ukrainian ethnicity and identity and statehood under question so many times. And I'm just, you know, making you aware of that. Secondly, Paul, you said that Ukrainian schools or Ukrainian education system did not do a good job, like teaching the children to be Ukrainian. Actually, I think that this opposition, even in the very far east and very far south, and means that Ukrainian system, despite the Russian propaganda, has done a good job. And even now, these stolen Ukrainian children who are now somewhere in Russia, you can recognize them not by the language because they speak Russian, but by the fact if you shout out Slava Ukraini, they will always respond, immediately, automatically respond Heroям Slava. So somehow, I think Ukrainian statehood has been doing a good job. But the question is,
don't forget the 2 points you made, because I have a response to both points, and my memory is not good, because I'm a little bit older than you, or maybe I'm super older than you, so you're not going to forget those 2 points. Because I could answer them now, and then you could go to your question.
Up to you. Maybe the third question is related to the...
Fine, so then do it now, and then we'll go back, correct?
Okay.
Please.
The question is about the identity of the classics, Ukrainian classics, because let's say Gogol or even Chekhov, they are of Ukrainian origin. And there is this discussion, how Ukrainian are they? Do they have to be attributed to Ukraine or not? Or, and so, or even if you go to a museum and you look at the picture of Malevich, and it's still unclear for some museum curators whether he's Ukrainian or Russian or just born in the Soviet Union. So can you please elaborate on that?
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, so first, don't sit down so I can look at you.
Thank you.
Because I'm answering your question, so I'm addressing you. First question is to you, what was the first, you see, what was the first thing you said? The second thing had to do about schools. That's right, exactly. Is this a Ukrainian audience or is this a non-Ukrainian audience? So, namely, yeah, what is your view of the setting right here? You say that when you're in a non-Ukrainian audience, you feel as if we are an endangered species. So, what is this audience for you? Is this a non-Ukrainian audience, and therefore you feel potentially endangered? Or is this a Ukrainian audience, and you don't feel endangered?
I think it's not about the audience, it's about how the topic is being discussed.
Oh, okay, so is the topic being discussed so far as among non-Ukrainians, and do you then would then feel endangered, or do you feel comfortable that you're listening to people who know a little bit about Ukraine?
I think if I go further with how the topic is being discussed, it's to, like, when we go to, like, particles, to details, somehow it's like the whole is falling apart into small particles. That's what, for example, even Russia is not allowing to do, although Russia is basically a make-believe state. But somehow you do not hear that as often as you hear that about Ukrainian ethnicity and identity.
Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which had to do with schooling. Yes. I just want to, you may have misunderstood what I said, or perhaps I didn't state it properly and have been misunderstood. I did not say that the educational system in Ukraine, since independence, is not doing a good job. And if we mean by not doing a good job, the job that they are doing is creating among the student body young people who know their Ukrainian language because they're now being taught it, and that they have a sense of being Ukrainian, let alone the general educational system in Ukraine, which is as good, if not better, than many other advanced societies. Certainly elementary and secondary education in Ukraine is better than the United States, which is garbage anyway. So the point is I'm not saying that the educational system is not doing a good job. What I said was, and this is important, that teaching of Ukrainian history, which is a required subject, and we'll get to your question of literature and art because it's related, is that the system still does not allow for, when you learn about what Ukrainian historical development is and what Ukrainian society is, how much are you young and secondary students in Ukrainian schools, how much do they know about the Baal Shem Tov? And how much do they even know that one of the most important strands of world Jewry was created on the territory of Ukraine? That is Hasidism. How much do students learn about the history of Jews? How much do students actually learn about the Crimean Khanate and Muslim culture as expressed through the Crimea, other than them being the enemies who came with bows and arrows and shot and took the poor, Ukrainian women, including harem, to, right? Only as a negative factor. So that is what I'm critical of. How much do they know about the history of Poles in the right bank, other than being landlords who exploited the poor Ruthenian peasants? This is what I was talking about when the educational system has not yet gotten there, and it is extremely important for it to get there, because if you believe that Ukraine should be a civic state with a civic identity, well then every people who live in that country have to have a voice. So if you go into a class, as a for instance, and you're teaching Ukrainian history in Vinnytsia, right? And the general narrative of someone's from Vinnytsia, that's fine. Good. Well, of course. So I knew. What do you think? You just like Vinnytsia out of the top of my head? So, okay, Vinnychanka. So the point is here, if someone is going to school in Vinnytsia, and the general Ukrainian historical narrative that is taught, clearly the local Poles are the enemies. Well, so that means that the local Poles didn't do anything positive in that area? And what about that little kid who's sitting in there, and either that child or their grandparents is Roman Catholic? Well, the Roman Catholics are terrible. I mean, what did they do to those poor Ukrainians in the 17th and 18th centuries? Namely, Ukrainian history has to be taught as a history of all of the peoples who have lived on that territory and have contributed to the history of that territory, so that the citizens of Ukraine today, of your generation, have you're hearing your own voice. You're remembering what your grandmother said, who may have still spoke Polish or maybe Yiddish. You have to feel comfortable that you're learning the history of your country in which you are a part. That was what I was saying about the still existing shortcomings in the Ukrainian educational system, but that's changing too. Now, the next question that you raise, very important question. You mentioned some writers and you mentioned some artists. What is the canon? Right? What is the canon? What is Ukrainian literature? Is Ukrainian literature only works that are written in some form of the Ukrainian language? Is that what Ukrainian literature is? Or, and that, by the way, is how it had been traditionally taught from the 19th century in Western Ukraine, where you could still do it, or under the Soviets. And then they give a little bit of leeway to the 16th and 17th, early 18th century, when writers were writing in Latin or in some nondescript version of Church Slavonic. Right, yeah, that's Ukrainian literature. But if you wrote in Polish, or you wrote in Russian, then you're not part of the canon. Because that was how Ukrainian literature was understood. To my mind, I'm not a literary historian, but I deal with literary historians a lot. And I always have this discussion about the canon. And the canon of what Ukrainian literature actually is and how it should be conceived and taught is that language is irrelevant. If an author is born, raised on the territory of Ukraine or even outside of the territory of Ukraine, but has within their literary works they express belonging to this land, then they are part of the canon of Ukrainian literature. And so the two that you mentioned are obviously Ukrainian writers, without question. What about the whole school of Polish writers from the right bank who were known as the Ukrainian school? Well, if you ask me, if you're going to create a Christomati, an anthology of Ukrainian literature, and I would even call it an anthology of the literature of Ukraine, right? These writers should be in there. And that they're part of Polish literature, so be it, who cares? They're born and raised and their subject matter is Ukraine. They're Ukrainian writers. So that's my answer to that. And ditto with regard to the artists. We know there's the Russian avant-garde at the beginning of the 20th century. Most of it took place in Kiev, and many of them were Ukrainian artists. And Malevich is not in that sense, as you probably well know, he's actually of Polish background, but he's born and raised and educated in Ukraine, therefore he is. Or if we're talking about choreography, well, where did Diaghilev get his best dancers? He got them from Kiev Ballet, and then he puts them on stage with music by Stravinsky, who wrote, by the way, The Rite of Spring in Ukraine on the estate just west of Novhorod-Sibirsk, in case you didn't know. And so these works also belong to the canon of Ukrainian musical culture, etc., etc. So that's how I would answer your question. The canon has to be made true as a canon of Ukraine and not just limited to what we believe is the Ukrainian language at any given point.
And the canon is made by the Ukrainians or by...
The canon is made by scholars, and they do whatever they want, and they have... Precisely. It's not made by... But not all Ukrainians necessarily even agree with what I'm saying, but they should.
Let's do one more question, because we're running out of time, and I think there's a lot of lively discussion. I could continue over some drinks, but let's go. Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was going to just a follow-up question to all of this, because it's really, I don't know why, but it hints me to United States of America. And for some reason, I start thinking that, why would you say that Ukraine is sort of the United States of Ukraine? Obviously, we don't have the jurisdictions like in the US, but the number of people and different ethnicities that are in Ukraine, and that now the Ukrainian identity is literally like a civic society, because what matters is that every single Ukrainian has its own view of how Ukraine would develop and you know how they would manage it. What unites them is the political choice that they made, right? Mm-hmm. So the follow-up to it is basically. Would you describe Ukraine as a, you know, kind of Ukraine as a United States of Ukraine, or or would you say that it's still kind of something similar to France and England, and Britain, or and just kind of a little tip that I was going to say that when you said about the special normal country or something like that, wouldn't you consider the leapfrogging and jumping ahead of competition, because for some countries it took almost 1,000 years to came to the civic, identity. Wouldn't you say this is being a special and remarkable case, as you just mentioned, like a success case? Because in Ukraine, Ukraine as a case, it's basically not only success, it's a leapfrog. It's basically just, it skipped those thousands of years of the national identity and switched it to civic. Even though it's not fully developed, it's just described because of a schooling system, yet there's still that because of a revolution in granite, the Maidan, and then basically the revolution of dignity.
Are you of ethnic Ukrainian background?
Yes.
You're exceptional. You are well, there's your answer. Of course. That was my point about 150 years ago to know Ukrainians, and now you've leapfrogged several times, and certainly in the last 10, 15 years. Absolutely. Now, with regard to the other question of kind of the United States, I can tell you my predilection. I am a regionalist, and I favor developing cultural, political distinctiveness. And so I'm all for Cornwall being a separate part of England, and certainly for Scotland to be independent. So that's my general predilection across the board. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, one of the first things that any independent country does is they have to adopt a new constitution. And it took Ukrainians a little bit of time. It took them for 5 years to do it. But during those 5 years, there was a whole host of discussion as what should be Ukraine, what should be the structure of Ukraine. And there were really basically two choices if you look at Europe. You could do the French style or the German style. Right? Forget the United States. That's, you stick with Europe. Comparisons, it's not a comparison, but Europe is a comparison. So you have a centralized state or you have a federal state. And we know that during this period, there were very strong forces that wanted a federal state. And then federal state divided how? Take the oblasts that the Soviets created, which were not historic, or created on the basis of some historic regions. Drawn from what? Well, maybe from the provinces of the Russian Imperial Empire. So I guess we would know where Volhynia is because we take what it was, the gubernia of Volhynia. We'd know what Galicia is. That's easy because it was Galicia within the Austrian, etc., etc. I personally, not surprisingly, favored the idea that Ukraine should be a federal structure. But no, the decision was to make it a centralized state in which the center decides everything. So you have a central ministry of education, you don't have a regional one, etc., etc. That was the choice of Ukrainians. This is the state you got. Now, of course, the Ukrainians being Ukrainians, as you well know, since you're one of them, you can make a decision and say you're going to do one thing, but in actual fact, it comes out a little bit different. So yeah, you have a centralized state, but the local regions do almost, in many cases, what they want anyway. And then after a while, a new government comes in and says, well, let's try to have decentralization and so forth and so on. So it's still, as in many societies. But you have created a centralized state structure. Now actually, even though I would have wanted the regional one, considering the other factor that we've been discussing, the need to create a strong civic identity for one nation state, well, maybe that decision that I disagreed with and many Ukrainians disagreed with of having a centralized state, maybe that was the right decision. Because it's easy to do it now. You don't have to tell Lviv to not teach too much Galician history because the program is being decided in Kiev anyway. You see? So, but that was how I would answer the question. Ukraine had the choice, and that's the decision they made.
Yes. So do you want to take it?
Yeah, I feel like that's a good place to pause and move on to the library for a glass of wine. But before I thank our speakers, I just wanted to make a shameless plug. We have just launched our third Literatura course, which will begin in June, and it is studying the literatures of Ukraine, literature
plural.
That's been written in Yiddish, in Polish, in German, and of course in Ukrainian, because that is very important to study the literature that was being written in Ukrainian, even though that language was being suppressed for centuries. And also, as much as we can continue discussing how history is being taught, let's remember that history is also being made, and that civic identity is very much flourishing at the moment as Crimean, Tatar Ukrainians, Roma Ukrainians, Polish Ukrainians, Jewish Ukrainians, ethnic Ukrainians are fighting side by side for statehood. And because they're fighting for statehood, they're fighting for each other's rights and for human rights, something that we here take for granted, and something that has acquired a new value, I think, in Ukraine, and something for us, I think, maybe to remind ourselves of that value. So, on that note, and of course, all of this fight is rooted in the culture of defiance and anti-imperialist oppression and so on, and struggle, which goes back to the 19th century or beyond. So here I wanted to defend the grandmothers and grandfathers, of course, but primarily grandmothers.
No, of course.
Who have created.
Of course. That's why they're so dangerous. That's my point. if you don't agree with their ideology, that's the point.
Please do join me in thanking our wonderful speakers, Paul Robert Magocii and Marnie Howlett, and join us for a glass of wine in the library. Thank you very much.